Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. I'm your host, James Splitsuit Sweeney, and today we're going to talk about lines. And not lines like strategic plays you might make, things we talk about all the time in this show, but instead we're going to talk about lines like what gets graphed out of your results, out of your poker database, and understanding what those lines are telling you. And just for the record, if you are a live player and you're like, I don't have these kind of graphs, so this isn't going to be useful to me, I would definitely suggest you continue listening on. The overall concepts here will be helpful nonetheless. So if you are using something like Poker Tracker 4 or Hold'em Manager, or you've just looked at general graphs online, you may notice that there's more than just a single line. When we first started playing online, we really had a single line on any graph, and it was really just your results graphed. How well are you doing up or down? Maybe it even showed it in your win rate, so BB per 100, but ultimately it was just a single results line, and that's all you got to see. Over time, a blue line was added, and a red line was added, and an EV/BB per 100 was added. And these are things that can create some confusion for players who see them like, I don't know what the heck this means, or my results or my graph look a little bit different than everyone else's. That is what we're going to talk about today through the lens of some questions that were asked on the Discord. As always, you can always ask your own questions at the Red Chip Poker Discord. Join for free today, redchippoker.com/Discord. We'd love to see you over there. Chat hands, chat strategy, ask questions with poker players that love the game just as much as you do. And without further ado, let's jump into today's episode all about graphing lines in poker. All right, so the first question comes from Louis Q, who asked the following. I imagine this is something that has come up before, but I've heard lots of people talk on forums videos about their red line being negative in Poker Tracker 4. I don't have a huge sample, but my blue line and red line are the opposite of the quote norm. Red line really positive and blue line really negative. Are there any immediate things people would suggest I look at? The one thing I can think of is reviewing my hero calls on the river, but I tend to feel I'm a bit on the nitty side. Alright, so let's get the initial stuff out of the way first. If you've never really looked at graphs, or you're not really 100% sure what a red line or a blue line is, there are three major lines that tend to get posted in something like Poker Tracker 4 and you're looking at your results. One is the green line, and that's just overall how much you are up or down. That's it. That's all it's telling you. Then you have your blue line, which looks at all money won in Showdown pots. So if you win a Showdown, that blue line goes up. If you lose a Showdown, that blue line goes down. Red line looks at all of the pots where there was no Showdown visible. So if you posted your blind and you folded pre-flop, so obviously you didn't get to Showdown in that situation, you lost a little bit on your red line. If you double barrel and your opponent folds, that is going to go in your red line since there was no Showdown seen, whereas if you get to Showdown, that's all going to get posted in your blue line. So if you add your red line plus your blue line, that equals your green line in terms of overall winnings. For average players, it tends to be that your red line is negative and your blue line is positive, which means that you are winning a lot of pots at Showdown and you're winning them sizably, and as such, your overall blue is on the positive side of the spectrum. You're not losing a ton at Showdown, whereas your red line tends to be negative because those are things like posting blinds or bluffs that failed or barrels that failed or times you floated but didn't get an opportunity to stab because your opponent barreled and as such you folded to that second barrel. Again, kind of situations where there's no Showdown at hand. So most people tend to be negative red, positive blue, and where that green line falters out is kind of dependent on exactly the extreme of that red line and that blue line. So one of the ways that these lines can get inverted, again, where that red line is going to be on the positive side and that blue line is going to be on the negative side, is a situation where we're being a calling station. So if we correctly fold in a given spot, right, our red line is going to go down and our blue line is going to stay even since there was no Showdown. As such, our blue line isn't getting impacted. Whereas if we call too wide, then our blue line is going to go down because those are going to be Showdown pots, and our red line is going to stay even since it's a Showdown, means there's not any non-Showdown, and as such the red line's not going to get impacted. So those are the ways that those lines can get impacted if you are a calling station. And then another way that you can invert these lines is by bluffing too much or value betting too thinly. So imagine that you bluff in a bad situation, right? One where you're supposed to be check folding instead. Well, sometimes the bluff is going to be successful. That means there's no Showdown, your opponent folded, and as such your red line is going to go up. And then the rest of the time when the bluff fails, then your blue line is going to go down and your red line's not going to get impacted because again it was a Showdown situation. So assuming that we correctly check fold, our red line is going to go down in a situation. So again, where there's inversion in these lines, this is typically what's going to be happening. One of these two things is typically at play. And then there is also a third thing that doesn't typically get discussed here, but I think it's important to mention, is just general small sample size and running good in that sample. So if you're getting an above average amount of premium hands, or you're getting above average amount of premium situations, good spots where you could just simply stab, tick up a lot of like steel pots pre-flop, or nice good barrel spots open up for you. Situations where, again, your red line would typically trend downwards or maybe break even-ish, but you're actually getting a bunch of good opportunities or good hands or whatever to be able to just attack, and all of a sudden your red line just starts creeping positive and positive and positive. Not necessarily indicative that that's going to be your long-term red line result, but it can definitely happen in the short term. So it's really important that when you're looking at these lines, especially over a smaller sample size, maybe a couple thousand hands, that you don't overdraw conclusions and say, hey, there has to be something wrong with my strategy. That may be the case, but it also could just be the case of, hey, you're getting an above average amount of good spots for your red line to poke up, in which case that could also be what's happening here. All right, question number 2 also comes from Louis Q and is pretty much an extension of the previous conversation. Louis says, how would running good over a small sample cause the negative blue line? So for a moment, take a trip with me. Let's go to Fantasyland. Let's go to this place that I'm sure has never ever existed for you in the world, because as poker players, we're always running insanely bad. Let's just say in Fantasyland over here, we're running super good. Everything's going in the right direction. What's typically going to happen if we graph what's going on during that period of run good? Chances are red line is going to be positive. Chances are our blue line is going to be positive. And as such, if red is positive and blue is positive, our green is most certainly positive as well. Fantasyland is sounding pretty darn good. But in this hypothetical situation, let's also think about what could happen in the short term. So let's say we're picking up this large amount of premium holdings. Well, we're betting, we're firing, we're raising, we're getting aggressive, because hands are good. It's nice and easy to be aggressive when that's the case. And our opponents just aren't getting hands that are quite strong enough to pay us off. Maybe they're calling a bet, but they're not calling all the way down to Showdown, or they're folding somewhere along the way. Maybe we're able to 4-bet a little bit more. They're still 3-bet folding a lot, whatever. So in that situation, it's easy to see we're not getting to Showdown, and our opponents are continuing to fold. We're continuing to be aggressive. We're picking up a lot of these non-Showdown pots, and as such, our red line is doing what? It's skyrocketing, definitely in the positive direction. Well, let's just say, again, during this period of running really well, some of the times we're not going to have the ultra premiums, maybe we're going to have something a little bit more strong marginal. And some of the times we're going to continue firing those, our opponents are going to call down, and we're going to end up losing at Showdown. So that blue line can hit the negative side. Well, again, we're picking up all those non-Showdown pots, so that red line is going positive. So it's important to understand, just through this simple illustration, that in the shortest term, the red line and the blue line can do all sorts of crazy things. So it's not necessarily that we should just focus on those, especially in the short term, where things can just be a little bit crazy and a little bit wonky. In that situation, I tend to focus a little bit more on the green, but overall, it's still, again, shorter sample size in general. You're not going to be able to get like super reliable data and analysis and results from it. And as such, you shouldn't put all your eggs into that basket and saying, hey, something is most certainly wrong with my game. Maybe, may also not be at the exact same time. So keep this in mind whenever you're looking at a graph that someone posts online, right? Even someone might post a 10,000 hand graph with a super sick red line. You're like, what in the heck are they doing? Something they're doing is really working for them, and I want to try to emulate that same thing. Again, 10K hands may seem like a lot, and it is a lot when you're playing it, but at the same time, it's kind of a small sample size in the grand scheme of things, and as such, again, there can be a lot of short-term luck in that. So don't overanalyze seeing a graph and saying, hey, I got to make strategic changes overnight because something's going wrong and that person has it figured out. That may not necessarily be the case, or they may have found a play style that works perfectly in the exact game they're in, wherever the heck they happen to be playing, but it may not necessarily translate to your game or the games you plan on playing in the future. All right, question number 3 also comes from Louis Q, and again is based upon this conversation of graphs. And Louis says, and on this is the best way to assess how you're running by using my currency all-in adjusted. All right, so to make sure that we are all on the same page in case you've never heard of this stat, my currency all-in adjusted is a stat that PokerTracker 4 describes as expected long-run winnings, also known as all-in adjusted EV, or the EV line, or Sklansky bucks if you're a little bit more old school. And essentially it shows you what you would have made had you always won your fair share of a pot when all in against your opponent's hand. So when you're looking at graphs in Poker Tracker 4, just like you have the option to turn on red line and blue line, you also have the option to turn on this EV line. And the way that you would look at it, or the way most people tend to look at it, is they'd say, okay, well, if the EV line is higher than my green line, my results line, then it looks like a spot where I am running bad. I'm not winning quite my fair share. Whereas if my results are higher than the EV line, then they would classify themselves as running good because they're winning, quote, more than their fair share. And at first glance, this looks like an amazing thing. It looks like a great stat for being able to interpret just how good or how bad we're running, and that should be more useful than just a broad strokes overall win rate line. The issue is that the EV stat, and as such the EV line, is virtually meaningless because it's really only looking at a single, very, very specific point of luck and not everything all in all. So the way that I've always thought about this line in this stat is that it's essentially a results-oriented kind of statistic. And the reason is because it's looking at the hand that you got in a situation against your opponent's exact hand, calculating the equities right that moment, and then analyzing the EV based upon all that. But the issue is that that's super results oriented because it's only looking at a single hand within your opponent's overall range. You're committing against an opponent's range of hands, not against that specific hand. So inherently, it's just more results oriented, and it's not the most useful thing in the world. It'd be different if it was looking at a complete breakdown of your opponent's range, looked at the equities based upon that range, not against a specific hand within their range. So, and you could also go a step further and say, okay, well, it's also looking at just a single hand in my range. It's not looking at my range versus their range and looking at the overall EV output. So it's not the most useful thing in the entire world if you just break it down from that point of view. And there's also another way to visualize and extrapolate this. So take a simple thought experiment with me for a moment. Say you're playing 100 hands of poker and in every single hand you got dealt top set, every single time. And your opponent always had second set. Sounds like a pretty great situation to me. And in that single run of 100 hands, we always stack off, our opponent always stacks off, but we only win 80% of the time. So top set should hold around 95% of the time. So according to our all-in EV line, we would definitely be, quote, running bad. Running actually quite bad because we're supposed to be winning around 95 and we're only winning around 80%. But if you think about it for just a quick moment, it'd be insane to describe this 100-hand run as running bad, right? Because we're simply hitting sets at an insanely high rate. We're always hitting top set. Our opponent is always hitting a second best set. And this is just like the absolute perfect primo spot. I mean, this is such incredible run good. You can't possibly classify this as running bad except through a single metric where you're looking at comparing our 80% win rate instead of a 95% win rate. So just looking at the all-in EV is extremely limited and not the most useful thing in the entire world. And for most players, I honestly suggest just turn it off. Don't even look at this stat. It's just going to create more confusion or negative feelings that you don't really need to have in the slightest. It's not the best look overall. If you really focus on your red line, your blue line, and your green line, that's going to be much more useful because if nothing else, you really can't do anything, strategically speaking, based upon your all-in EV. So why would you really focus on this stat in the first place? Even though I know a lot of people like to put it on their overall graph, maybe it makes them feel a little better overall, but ultimately, I would pretty much just scrap this. It's not going to do too much for you at the end of the day. Alright, our next question comes from JRG84, who says, I've got a question for y'all. I've had a positive non-showdown winnings and break-even-ish showdown winnings over the past few thousand hands at 10NL, VPIP of around 26-ish playing 6-max. Is this indicative of overbluffing? Any adjustments I can make to increase my showdown winnings? My strategy seems to be working in my stake, but I don't know if it'll fly at 25 no limit and above. So if we think about what this graph looks like, the blue line is roughly break even, the red line is positive, and as such the green line is going to be positive as well, so that's overall a good thing. So what is causing this? Well, again, based upon our answer from the first question here, probably going to be something like calling down too wide, or bluffing too much, or value betting too thinly, or a sample size issue. Being that this is only a few thousand hands, that could definitely be at play here. So I've said it a couple times already, but I think it's worth repeating one more, is focus on your green line. In the short term, those red lines, those blue lines can go all over the place for so many different reasons, so focus more on green than you would on red or blue in any smaller sample size especially. And again, not the results are the most telling thing in the world anyway, because those can also be skewed based upon run good, run bad, that kind of stuff. It's still going to be more reliable in the same sample size, especially smaller ones, compared to just looking at red or just looking at blue or overly focusing on those two irrespectively. irrespective of the green line. Simply because if you're making a bunch of money, really positive green line, and maybe you've figured something out, right? That's kind of the most important thing. Even if the lines are reversed and you have positive red, negative blue, if you're overall making lots of green, that's really what matters at the end of the day. And perhaps that's actually whatever kind of playstyle you figured out, especially if this is over a larger sample size, could actually be what's causing you to make so much more green and have a higher win rate than other people in your game. That's also a possibility, especially as, again, that sample size gets larger and larger, so you can actually confirm that rather than a small sample size, which again is going to be more prone to massive variance and massive swings in terms of the way that short-term samples can go in this game. Because keep in mind, poker has not yet reached the point where there is a single strategy that can work, where all red lines and blue lines should look the exact same in the long term. That's just simply not the case. If you look throughout poker history, there are players that have been incredibly profitable with massive red lines, negative blue lines, and there have been losing players that have the more traditional positive blue line, negative red line. So which player would you rather be at the end of the day? I kind of know which one I would choose, and I think you would choose the exact same thing when you actually break it down and think about it. And that is going to conclude our conversation on red lines, blue lines, green lines, a little bit of EV lines as well, and hopefully this helps you kind of wrap your head around graphs that you're looking at online or looking at in a Discord and understanding what the heck is going on when you're looking at all of these colorful graphs. As always, if you have any comments or questions, please do not hesitate to let us know. You can always ask directly in the Discord. Again, redchippoker.com/Discord to join for free. And I think that's going to wrap it up for this episode. If you have any comments or questions, just leave a comment or again, post on Discord and we will get back to you as soon as we possibly can. And in the meantime, I'll leave you to it. I'll see you back in a couple weeks with a brand new episode. In the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.